Ann Badmus, and welcome to our immigration webinar for the month of July, Opening Doors to U.S. Business, a guide to E-2 and E-1 visas for immigrant entrepreneurs. Thank you all for connecting with us today, and we hope to provide an informative webinar that will give you the basics and some information about these types of visas for those who are interested in starting or continuing a business in the United States. Before I go on, I just want to double check that our systems are working correctly. So please confirm that you can hear me by typing into the chat feature, chat area, yes, if you can hear me. And one person can do that for me. I appreciate it. All right, great. Thank you so much. I'm glad you all can hear. The good thing about our webinar format is that you can ask questions at any time. But if you do want to ask a question, please use the Q&A bubble or panel that should be at the right of your screen, or at least where you can see that icon that looks like a question mark. Use that section to ask your questions. It helps us to keep track of all the questions that we have and making sure that we are able to answer everyone in the order received. Typically, we will answer questions at the end of towards the end of the webinar. We do ask that if you ask a question, please try to keep the question very general without providing personal details. This is an open platform, and we do want to maintain your confidentiality. Okay, so for those of you who may not know about our firm, I did want to provide some information about Badmus Associates. Since 1993, we've helped thousands of clients gain legal immigration status in the United States. We have been honored with the Best Lawyers in Dallas for Immigration by D Magazine, as well as Best Lawyers List and Best Law Firms List for Dallas-Fort Worth area by U.S. News and World Report. So today, as I mentioned, we are going to be talking or giving information about certain visas called the E-visa or E-treaty, investor, treaty, trader visas, as I'll explain in more detail. But this is purely information. It's very general, and so should not be relied upon for your specific circumstance. Each case is different. So if you feel that you might qualify or need more information about E-visas as they might apply to your situation or someone else's situation that you know of, then please feel free to reach out to us to schedule a consultation. So treaty trader, which is E-1, and treaty investor, E-2 visa overview. Before talking specifically about these visa options, I just want to briefly talk about the advantages to these visa options. The main advantage, of course, is that if you are an immigrant entrepreneur wanting to either start up or you're currently conducting business in the U.S. and you want to be able to reside in the U.S. And develop and direct your business, then this is one of the best ways to do that. But of course, you need to be at least a citizen of the treaty country, and we'll go over the countries that are eligible in a few minutes. And you need to be here specifically to qualify for the E-visas. You need to be your purpose in coming to the U.S. would be to develop and direct that specific business. So this is not a general work visa situation, but it is for those who are interested in operating a business in the U.S. and has either put a substantial investment or has substantial trade with the United States. The other good feature about the E-visa is that you can, even if you are not the business owner, you can potentially hold a E-visa if you are a worker for a business owned by a qualifying investor. So for example, if you are a Canadian citizen and the owner of the business, US business is also a Canadian citizen, then you could be eligible to obtain an E-1 or E-2 work visa as an employee to work for that business. In some instances, this is great for those who are professional workers that might not be able to get an H-1B visa because of the limited number of H-1B visas. for E1 and E2 employees, there's no limit on the number of visas that can be issued for those who qualify, but it is very specific to those workers who are going to be working in specialized areas or be in supervisory or managerial positions. Another good feature of the e-visa is that spouses can work if they are, spouses can work if they are dependent or hold an E2 or an E1 dependent visa. So a spouse, if you are the investor or the trader in the business, or you're the owner of the business, but your spouse wants to work as well, then actually the spouse can actually work without any further visa requirements. So for example, he or she would obtain an E2 or an E1 dependent visa, and that automatically allows them to work as soon as they obtain that status. And they can work for any company or even start their own business, or they can be involved in your business as well. Another feature is that the children under the age of 21 do obtain a dependent visa as well, and they can attend school and college as long as they're under the age 21. So there is the age restriction is pretty important for those of you who do have older children, because if the older child, as the older child gets closer to age 21, you may look at considering other types of visas for them. So for example, getting a student visa. However, you may also consider that the child over the age 21 might be also eligible for an E2 visa. Either they can be part owner of the business, or they can work in your business in one of those essential capacities, as I mentioned, as an E2 or an E1 employee. So there are options for those children who are over age 21 if you are wanting them to also come to the US and work in the business. Finally, the other advantage is that the E2 or E1 visa is unlimited in terms of how long anyone can hold an E2 or an E1 visa. Initially, in most cases, when you enter the US or when you get your status changed to an E1 or E2 visa, the initial time frame you have is 2 years. However, you can extend your visa for 2 year in 2 year increments. As long as you're operating the business, you can continue to renew your visa and stay indefinitely. Of course, though, it does not necessarily convert or lead to citizenship, but it will give you an opportunity to look for other options while you're in the U.S., other options for permanent residence or green card while you're in the U.S. There is no restriction from going from an E2 or an E1 visa to a permanent residence green card, as long as you qualify for permanent residence through whatever pathway that you can qualify. I have a note here, someone's lost audio. Can someone confirm whether or not you can still hear me? If you are hearing me, can someone just put yes? Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so now on to the specifics of these E2 e-visa programs. The first one I will talk about is the Treaty Trader E1 visa program. This program is probably the less used than the E2 option that I'll talk about in a minute. However, it has some similarity. First of all, it does require that to qualify, you must be a citizen of one of the treaty countries. So the treaty countries are the countries that have signed with the United States for a specific treaty that allows for this type of business opportunity between citizens of the US and citizens of these other countries. You can find the list of countries at the website here, and I'll try to see if I can actually share my screen to allow you to see that listing itself. So hopefully you can see it. I am showing the screen or the website, which is the Department of State website, which lists all of the countries that are currently signed on to the treaties that allow its citizens to get an E2 or an E1 visa. The country list is pretty extensive, but it does by no means cover all countries in the world. And as you can see, if you look on that website, you'll see that some countries are eligible for E-1, some are eligible for E-2, some are eligible for both. So it's always important if you are considering or are wanting to know if you're eligible for an e-visa to check the country's list to see if your country is listed. If you have dual citizenship, you may be, you will certainly want to consider that as well. So even if you are a citizen of a country that is not on the list, if you are a citizen of another country that's on that list, then you are still qualified or could still be qualified for the treaty visa. So as I mentioned here, so that's the number one step. So the basic requirement for the treaty trader E-1 visa program is that you or your company, specifically your company, is engaged in exchange, purchase, or sale of goods or merchandise primarily to the United States. So you must have proof that you have been trading with the United States, or not with the United States, but with other companies or businesses or even consumers in the United States, where more than half of your sales have been between the US and the treaty country. So for example, if you are, I'll use Canada again as an example. If you are a citizen of Canada and you have been providing services or selling goods to other companies, B2B or B2C to the US, and those sales are more than 50% of your international trade, then you could qualify for the treaty trader. So when we talk about what is trade includes goods and services. So it can be things like technology transfer, architecture and engineering services, consulting, accounting, or just other goods imports and exports. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute about different types of businesses that have been successful for E-1 visas. But the trade in goods and services should be substantial, either in terms of how large the transactions are, the number of transactions, the volume of transactions. So again, this is very general information. If you have a business that you think qualifies, we would have to look more in detail into your records to show what types of transactions and sales that you had between your business, wherever it may be, and in the United States. So the application process, I'll go briefly over that as well. This process is pretty much the same whether you are the owner of an E-1 business or you have employees that you want to bring into the United States to help manage or to provide services to your business. So the first thing, of course, is documentation. The requirement is that you have, of course, your passport to prove that you are a citizen of one of the treaty countries. There's very specific visa application forms that I have listed here. And then very much importantly, you need to prove the substantial trade between your business outside the US and to the US. The procedures are typically we suggest that you apply at the US Embassy in your home country. So again, if you're in Canada, you would need to apply to the US Embassy in Canada, usually in Toronto, and provide all of the documentation and requirements. Each embassy or consulate has its own procedure. I'm providing here just sort of the basics of what's typically required, but each embassy usually has their own list of what they're looking for, what information they would like, and information about how long their process will take. But in general, or relatively, the E-2 visa or the E-1 visa is a relatively quick process compared to other immigration processes. So it can take as little as a couple of weeks to a few months in order to get the visa processed and hopefully approved. When you do get an E-1 visa, usually it's issued for 5 years, and your company, it's very specific to your company. So your company will be registered as an E-1 company, and that visa will be issued to you specifically for 5 years with a designation as to what company is the sponsor or the trading company for you. 5 years, but then it can be renewed. So you can renew, as I mentioned before, you can renew or maintain E-1 status indefinitely forever if you wish. But you will have to go through that process every 5 years. Now, there is a distinction between a visa being issued for 5 years. So a visa in your passport, or what we call the visa stamp in your passport, is kind of like a ticket to come into the country. So once you come into the country, the I-94 is what determines how long you can stay in the country. So typically for e-visas, when you come into the country, you will get an I-94 that is good for 2 years. So you must be careful to be sure that you do not overstay that 2 years, that either you leave and come back again, even if it's for a day, you go out and you come back in and you get another 2 years, or you file a change of status in the US or an extension of status where you're asking your I-94 stay to be extended for another 2 years. For most people, it's a better option to just travel out and come back in. It's much easier and less paperwork to do that. But if travel is not an option, then you can actually request the government, Department of Homeland Security, to extend your stay by filing a specific petition called an I-129 petition to extend your stay. I see some questions here about what would be considered substantial and different things like that. So substantial basically means a big part of your business. So more than 50% of your business comes from trading with the United States. If you can show that, then that would be considered substantial. On top of that, of course, it would need to be a consistent trade. It would not be, I traded once and that was 50% of my business, what a one-time trade. This would be a consistent trading that's going on between your company and customers in the United States. So as part of proving substantial and continuous trade, in order to have a strong E-1 visa application, you will need to provide detailed evidence of the volume and frequency of your trade. So things like any invoices and contracts that you have with consumers or customers in the U.S., any shipping records, if you're doing things like import, export, or movement of any goods. For services, that would not necessarily be the case. You would not have shipping records, but you could have things like contracts, invoices, even correspondence between you and the customers in the U.S. where you're negotiating or issuing agreements or signing off on agreements, that sort of thing. And then, of course, they're also going to want to see your financial records for the company, such as transactions from bank statements or sales and income receipt. Income received from bank statements. And then you also can do things like inventory records, your financial statements, that sort of thing. So those are the kinds of things that you can provide in order to prove that you do have substantial trade with the U.S. Some examples of E-1 businesses. So the easiest example would be something like an import-export company where, for example, a Japanese-owned business specializing in import and export of automotive parts between Japan and the United States. So this is where a company regularly ships parts to U.S. manufacturers and imports automotive components back. So there's substantial trade going on. Another example is more of a service business where let's say a consulting firm. So let's say if you're a management consulting firm from Germany that provides consulting services to U.S. companies. So that means your German firm sends consultants for projects and continuously engages in that. And I would say typically you need to show at least over a year period of that kind of trade going on to show substantial trade in your services. Another example would be similar to that, technology solutions providers. So if you're a Canadian company, as an example, offering cloud computing solutions and software development services to US clients, where you're frequently exporting your technology, your software products, and other kinds of support to the US, that could demonstrate substantial trade in both goods and services. And then finally, agricultural exporters. So for this example is an agricultural business from Mexico exporting organic produce, and the company regularly ships large amounts of fruits and vegetables to the US, showing substantial trade. The next program, the E-2 visa program, is more often used than the E-1 program. So we'll talk quite a bit about that. So again, nationality is important. The same list of countries you would reference to be sure that your country, you are a citizen of one of the treaty countries. But here, you do not necessarily have to show that you've had a record of trade as you would with the E-1 visa. Instead, this is really for those who either they may not have a business at all. You may not have a business at all outside the US. This may be your first company that you're starting up. This may be first company or first business that you're purchasing, for example. And so you do not necessarily have to show that you've done business outside the US previously. There's no trade requirement here. It's really more about your investment. If you are investing into a US business and meet the criteria, then you could be eligible for an E-2 visa. So what is the investment? The investment must be substantial. Similar to substantial trade, you must show substantial investment in a real operating enterprise. So what does that mean? And we often get the question, how much do we need to invest? Unlike the EB-5 program, where there's a definite amount that the government states is a minimum amount, the E-2 visa program does not necessarily state a minimum amount. It is very much dependent on the type of business that you are either starting or buying. So the government typically uses what they call a proportionality test, which means the amount of the investment must be substantial in relation to the total cost or the startup cost of either purchasing or starting up a business. So for example, if you are starting up an accounting business and you're an accountant and you want to start up an accounting firm, what are the typical costs for the accounting firm? If the typical startup cost is $50,000 and you provide the proof that this is sufficient to start up an accounting firm, then you need to invest $50,000. On the other hand, if you are planning to start a manufacturing business, which may be $10 million to start, then you may need to only show 10% of that investment is coming from you. So for example, a $10 million business might require a $1 million investment. In most cases, especially for small businesses, people buying into either retail or different types of businesses, we're not looking at investments that high. Just sort of rule of thumb, if your business startup is under $100,000 or less, then you should expect to pay $100,000 or invest $100,000. So the more expensive the business startup cost is, actually the less proportionally you have to pay. But a business that is not necessarily considered as expensive, like a business that only costs $100,000 or less, you need to invest 100% of the startup cost. In addition, as the investor, you must own 50% or more of the business. So minimum ownership is 50% of the E-2 investor. You can own with other people who might be citizens, or they might be permanent residents, or they could be another investor who also wants to, another E-2 investor who wants to be part of the business and also get an E-2 visa. But the purpose of your intent to come to the US and obtain an E-2 visa must be to develop and direct the business itself. So that is the only professional work that you will be doing, is to work in the business. You are not permitted to work for another company while running a business at the same time. You must work for your own business if you're an E-2 visa. Another important, very, very important, and this is one of the criteria that is the most difficult or could cause you not to be approved, even if you invest $100,000. The business itself must not be marginal. So marginal doesn't necessarily mean that it's a low amount of investment. You could have a low amount of investment, but the business not be marginal. What it means is that the business is not just for you to support yourself. It's not a one-person business where you're going to be working at home and being able to do business and make money and support your family. They want to see a business that can sustain growth, and especially sustain growth in terms of hiring employees in the U.S., because one of the purposes of the E-visa is to be sure that there's or to allow for improvement in the employment opportunities for U.S. citizens and others living in the United States. So a business would not be marginal if you are going to be hiring or have employees who will be helping you to run the business or operate the business. And finally, it is startup cost. E-2 can apply to any type of business, whether it's a startup where you're starting from the very beginning, you're going to make the investment to start up from scratch, or you're going to purchase an existing business. There are many business brokers out there who are very happy to work with E-2 investors to be able to find a business that is already operational. And it tends to be actually an easier process to get, or not easier, but more highly approved process if you are purchasing a business as opposed to starting up a business, because it's a lot easier to prove that you're making the substantial investment. It's a lot easier to prove that the business itself is a viable business. So, but that's not to say that startup businesses cannot be approved. We have many startup businesses that are approved, as well as businesses that are purchased. So the application process for E-2 is very similar to the E-1 process. Essentially, you need to have your passport and other documentation to prove your nationality, complete the required forms. But unlike the E-1 visa, it's more focused not on the substantial trade, but proof of your investment. And very, very important is a business plan, a very detailed business plan that describes how you will, even if you're buying an existing business, you will still need a business plan to show how you believe the business will grow over the next 5 years in revenues as well as staffing. And then, of course, you will need to provide proof of your financial ability to invest as well. We'll go more in detail as to the specific documents that you need. But again, the process is very much the same. You would apply for the visa at the U.S. Embassy in whatever country you are in. And typical process will take several weeks to a few months. But again, each embassy has its own requirements. So you always need to check the embassy website to see specifically what they are looking for in terms of applying for an E-2 visa. There is always, I did not mention before, but there is always an interview requirement for these visas at the embassy. So once you apply, you submit the information. They will actually review your business plan and all your documents in advance. And then after they've completed the review, they will invite you for an interview so that you can explain and answer any questions they might have about your business. If you get approved for the E-2 visa, you will receive usually a visa issued for 5 years that can be renewed indefinitely. But again, your stay in the United States is limited to 2 years for each entry. So you have to be careful to note when your I-94 expires so that you can be sure to either extend it or leave the US and come back in for another 2-year stay. But you still also have the option, if you are in the US already in another legal status. So let's say, for example, you've come into the US as a business visitor or as a visitor, and you decide that you want to apply for an E-2 visa without going to the embassy. that is an option. You can file an I-129, or your business can file an I-129 petition for a change of status. And in doing so, though, if you are approved for that change of status to E-2, as long as you are in the United States, you are allowed to continue to operate your business, and you will be considered the E-2 status. However, once you travel outside the US, if you leave the US, you will need to go to the embassy and start the E-2 visa process all over again with the embassy. So sometimes it's better to go ahead and start with the embassy, get your 5-year visa, and you will not need to have to do that process twice. So finally, I just want to talk about the tips for a strong E-2 visa. As I mentioned before, a business plan is very critical. You need to make sure that your business plan is detailed and comprehensive, and includes 5-year projections of income and expenses. And very much key is, showing that you're going to have employees, staff growth. You also need to show who are the competitors in your area. They want to see that you have, looked at those things pretty much like a bank would if you were trying to get a bank loan and they ask for a business plan. Same kind of concept here. The government wants to see that you've done your homework and really understand the viability of your business and the opportunity for growth in your business. Substantial investment is very, very important. So you need to document how much you are investing, but very importantly, how did you receive the funds in order to invest? So you will need to provide bank statements, wire transfers to show where you move money from your bank account to the business account. Any tax returns, personal tax returns that will show how you obtained your funds. Because the key to that is they want to be sure that all the funds that you're submitting have been legally obtained. So if you have accumulated through your savings and through your employment, they'll want to know you want to show that's how you accumulated the funds to make this investment. You can use loans. The loans have to be very structured in a certain way. So if you're interested in a loan to help for your investment, it's very possible, but we have to make sure that the loan is structured correctly. So all those things are very important to show the substantial investment. The non-marginality. So as I mentioned before, marginality is very important. You do not need, the government wants to feel comfortable that your business is not just for the purpose of giving you an income for you and your family. So they want to see the potential through profit and loss statements, especially if you are buying a business, tax returns, payroll records, detailed, and most importantly, if you're just starting out with a startup business, detailed business plans projecting future growth and profitability. And then finally, one of the things they do look at, although it's not absolutely important, is your ability to develop and direct the business. So however, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have had business experience previously, but it does, they do want to know what your background is and see if you have done your homework in terms of being able to develop this business. So some examples of E-2 businesses include, of course, typical restaurants and cafes. So many investors have used E-2 visas to open or acquire restaurants, cafes, bakeries, retail stores, boutique shopping, boutique clothing shops, to specialty grocery stores, or any other type of retail business. Technology startups. Again, you do not necessarily have to be in retail. It can be professional services like software development, IT consulting, e-commerce platforms. So technology, this is a great way for those who are nationals of E-2 treaty countries to be able to start up a business, a technology startup using the E-2 visa. Healthcare services. So some investors have established medical practices, even wellness centers with the E-2 visa. Franchise. So franchise or purchasing a franchise is probably one of the best options. Many franchise companies actually seek out foreign investors or foreign potential franchisees, and are very understanding of the E-2 visa process. They usually do want you to have an attorney, of course, who's involved in making sure that all the I's are dotted and T's crossed to be sure that you would have a good chance of getting approval for an E-visa. But franchise is really one of the good options there. Manufacturing companies, of course, again, the startup costs are a lot higher, but the investment amount is proportional to that. And then you have professional services, as I mentioned, accounting, even law firms, marketing agencies, and then many real estate developers are using E-2 visas to develop real estate, commercial properties, even flip properties. There are all kinds of options you can have there. So those are generally the kinds of businesses. This is, again, not a comprehensive list or a limited list. Any legitimate business can qualify for an E-2 visa. You just have to prove your case in terms of the investment, in terms of the viability of the business, and in terms of course, your qualifications. Okay, so I will now, again, remind everyone that this information I provided, has been a little brief, but there's a lot more details involved. We just don't have the time to go through every detail required for these types of visas, but I hope this has given you a general idea. But if you do think that this might be an option, or you think of any clients, customers, who, or colleagues, friends that might, relatives that might want to consider an E-visa, please feel free to reach out to us. But I want to go ahead now and answer questions. I think we have a few questions here. I do remind everyone, if you can, to use the Q&A feature, which is the question bubble that's on your platform, to write your question. If you don't, that's fine, but I do see a few in the chat. But if anyone who has not asked a question would like to ask a question, please put the question in the Q&A chat. So there is a question kind of related to the substantial sales volume. So the question is, so as an example, if I have a business that does $400,000 out of a total of sales volume to the U.S., out of $700,000, would that qualify? So I think the question is $400,000 of sales volume out of $700,000 total sales volume that you have. So yes, I mean, that is more than half. So that should be, at least initially, just based on this basic information, there's more required in order to apply, but it would look like that you would have substantial trade, since you have more than 50% of your sales volume to the US. Another question is, you can leave the country and return without, leave the country for a day and return without issue. So I think this question relates to, as I mentioned, if you have an E-2 visa and you have your 2-year I-94 stay, in order to extend that stay, you can just leave the country and come back in, like the question says, for a day. Yes, you can leave for a day, even if it's just to go, across to Mexico or to Canada, and just come back in, showing your E-2 visa. When you come back in with your E-2 visa, they will give you another 2-year stay. Of course, with an E-2 visa, you can leave at any time. If you need to take international trips, as long as your visa is unexpired, you can leave and come back in. And every time you come back in, you will receive another 2-year I-94. But yes, the purpose of the E-2 visa is to, having the 5-year visa, is to allow you to do those things like travel internationally. So as long as you are continuing to operate your business, then you are able to do that, and you should not have any issues returning back. Whenever you leave the country, whether it's for a day or a month or a year, you can still return back with the E-2 visa, as long as as long as the visa is unexpired and you're still operating the business. And the question here is, how do I schedule a consultation? What do I need to have prepared prior, and what is the average range or cost from start to finish? So schedule a consultation with us. I will send everyone a link afterwards, which has the information to schedule a consultation with us. It's very easy to go on to our online calendar and find a convenient date for you and schedule based on whatever the availability is there. Before the consultation, I would suggest that everyone, you have at least an idea of the business. You don't necessarily have to have a business already purchased or already started up on the business, but please do have a business idea or concept to discuss so that we can look at, you know, the viability of that and also know how much you can invest, how you would be able to prove your investment ability based on where how you obtain the funds, those types of things. The average range of costs to getting an E-2 visa. So in terms of fees, typically you're looking at different fees. You're looking at attorney fees, you're looking at business plan provider fees. We always recommend to work with an established business plan provider who knows about E-2 visas and knows what's required in those business plans. Then you have your application fees to the government. So probably in terms of those types of visa preparation things, you're looking at almost about $10,000 to be able to have a good assistance with your visa application. Now, also keep in mind that investment of attorney's fees, accounting fees, any fees that are necessary for the startup of your business or even for obtaining an E-2 visa are considered part of your investment amount. So if you need to make, if your startup cost are $50,000, that $50,000 would include any types of fees like that. So that all that is included as far as the government is concerned as part of your investment. Let's see, I think that's all the questions I see so far. We have a few minutes if anyone has any other questions. While doing that, I do want to mention that with an E-2 visa, it is specific to a specific business. So if you decide that you want to sell that business, for example, and go on to buy a different business, and that business was not covered in your initial application, then you will need to apply for a new E-2 visa. So it is very much, if there are major changes to your business, whether it's in ownership or whether it's in the type of services or goods that you're providing, you definitely want to reach out to your attorney to be sure that they can look at that and see if it's required that you file a new E-2 visa application or amend the E-2 visa application so that it's covered. You do not want to have a situation where the government says that you are going outside of the terms of your E-2 visa. Let's see, I have another question here. Is if you're on the E-2 visa, is it advisable to rent or buy a place of residence? Would buying or owning a house help in approving or obtaining the green card? So to answer the second question, no, a home ownership has no relationship to an E-2 visa or even a green card process. I mean, it's you can, do that. I mean, you definitely will need to have a place to live, of course, in the U.S. if you are going to be here the majority of your time, but it does not help. They're not looking at, did you buy a house or did you rent a house, or, those kinds of personal living circumstances are not part of the E-2 visa process. They're interested in what you are investing into the business itself. Have a question here about what type of businesses qualify. So we did go over in the presentation some of the types of businesses that other people have purchased or started up using an E-2 visa, but pretty much there's no type of business. It's any business that is a legal business that is eligible. It just really depends on the startup cost, how much you have to invest, a variety of factors, but there is no such thing as this is an E-2 visa, E-2 business. All businesses can qualify for an E-2 visa. Okay. Let's see, so if there are no further questions, I would have a request to my audience here. Please share your thoughts with us. Share your thoughts about our webinar. We'd love for you to give us a Google review. Your feedback really helps others discover this information. So thank you for your support. If you give us a Google review, we really appreciate it. And then we do have, I see a few more questions. I'll go ahead and answer that, but I want to go ahead and put up my contact information because I do see some people asking about that. So if you would reach out to us, ideally, the best way to schedule an appointment or to schedule a consultation, as I mentioned, we're going to go ahead and send out a follow-up email with that information, but you can also go to our website, to the contact section of our website, and fill out a very brief form, which will start the process for setting up a consultation or an appointment. So just since we do have a little bit of time, I'll go ahead and answer a few more questions. The question is, if I have already generated over 50% to volume as an independent contractor, is it advisable to set up a corporation prior to applying, or do you help? Yes, that's very specific. I'd love to talk with you about that over a consultation, because I have to get more details about that, but it is possible, but we'll need to look at a few more things for that. Another question, what's the difference between an E-1 and an E-2 visa? So the E-1 visa is related to trade. This is not about investment. It's about your business, your foreign business having trade relations with the United States. So what I mean by that is that you are actively selling your goods and services to consumers or companies in the United States. So, but from your foreign company. So you would have a company outside the U.S. that you, over maybe the past year, have been, exporting your goods to the U.S. and more than 50% of your international trade is associated with the United States. So let's say if you trade all over the world, but 50% of your international trade comes from the United States. The E-2 visa is an investor visa. You do not need to have an existing company outside the U.S. You can start up a new company in the U.S. You can buy a business in the U.S. And if you make a substantial investment in proportion to the startup cost or the purchase cost of the U.S. business, then you could be eligible. But in any event, both of the E-1 and E-2 visa require that you be a citizen of one of the of a country that is approved for these types of visas. And you can find those countries online at the Department of State. Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This is recorded, so you will all receive a copy of the recording. And also, again, as I mentioned, information about how to reach out to us. Hopefully this has been informative for you, and we appreciate your support in joining us today. Thank you very much and have a great day.